In the final years of the Russian Empire, behind Emperor Nicholas II stood a shadow. Legends call him the Black Monk. Was he a real person who secretly ruled the country? A powerful sorcerer? Or just a ghost? The history of the final years of the Russian Empire is shrouded in a thick fog of rumors, prophecies, and ominous omens. At the center of this web stands the figure of the last emperor, Nicholas II, and his family. But there is one shadow, one ghost, that still stirs the imagination of researchers and mystery lovers. This is the figure of the so-called Black Monk. Who was he? A sinister advisor who secretly controlled the will of the sovereign? A powerful sorcerer who predicted the downfall of the dynasty? Or just a figment of the collective imagination, a symbol of the dark force that inexorably led the empire to ruin? The very question of the existence of a certain Black Monk at the court of Nicholas II baffles us. In official documents, diaries, and letters of contemporaries, we find no direct mention of a person with such a nickname. However, the legend proved surprisingly resilient. It is passed down by word of mouth, appears in pseudo-historical works, creating an image of a gray cardinal in a cassock, whose invisible hand guided the events of a fateful period in Russian history. To understand the origins of this myth, we must immerse ourselves in the atmosphere of that era. The turn of the 19th and 20th centuries was a time not only of technological progress and revolutionary ideas, but also of an unprecedented surge of interest in mysticism, spiritualism, and the occult. All of Europe, from the aristocratic salons of Paris to the foggy streets of London, was fascinated by communication with spirits, predictions, and the search for secret knowledge. Russia was no exception. Moreover, this fashion was superimposed on a deep ancient folk belief in prophets, holy fools, and God's people. Warty, the imperial court, despite all its outward pomp and adherence to strict etiquette, was a mirror of these sentiments. Emperor Nicholas Alexander, a deeply religious man prone to fatalism, and his wife, Empress Alexandra Feodorovna, desperately sought spiritual support in a world that was falling apart at the seams. Their personal tragedy, the incurable illness of their only son and heir, Tsarevich Alexei, made them particularly susceptible to any promises of a miracle. It was on this fertile ground, fertilized by fear, hope, and a general sense of impending disaster, that the image of a mysterious monk could grow. This image became a convenient explanation for many inexplicable events. Why did the emperor make decisions that seemed disastrous for the country? Why was his circle of advisors constantly changing? And why did dubious individuals come to power? It was much easier to blame everything on the evil will of one man, a kind of demonic puppet master, than to acknowledge a systemic crisis of power and the monarch's tragic inability to cope with the challenges of the time. Thus, the Black Monk is not so much a real person as a necessary myth born in a turbulent era. He is a symbol of disintegration, the embodiment of those irrational forces that, as many believed, had seized power in a vast country. Our investigation is an attempt to separate this myth from reality. We will trace the path of every rumor and every legend to understand who was really behind the last Russian Tsar. Were these real people? And if so, why did popular rumor cloak them in the sinister shadow of the Black Monk? The journey into the past begins, and its first stop is the world of literature, where we will meet the most famous Black Monk in Russian culture. Before we begin our search for the Black Monk in the corridors of the Winter Palace, we must take a look at the world where he was born long before the collapse of the empire, the world of literature. In 1893, a year before Nicholas II ascended the throne, The great Russian writer Anton Pavlovich Chekhov wrote one of his most mysterious and profound stories, The Black Monk. This work, published in 1894, presented the reading public with an image that has become part of Russia's cultural code forever. The main character of the story, Andrei Kovrin, a master of philosophy, a refined and nervous man, weary from intellectual work, comes to rest at the estate of his former guardian. There, against the backdrop of idyllic nature and blooming gardens, he begins to see a ghost, a mirage of a gray-haired monk dressed in black. This monk is not an evil spirit in the usual sense. He is a conversationalist, a philosopher who instills in Kovrin the idea of his own uniqueness, his genius, and his high destiny. The monk tells him that he is one of God's chosen ones, called to serve eternal truth. For Kuragin, these visions become a source of indescribable happiness and creative inspiration. He believes in his chosen status and feels like a genius. However, those around him see this as nothing more than symptoms of mental illness, madness. They try to treat him, to return him to a normal state. In the end, Kuragin loses his ghostly companion, but with him, he loses his self-confidence, becoming mediocre. The ending of the story is tragic. Dying of consumption, Kovrin sees his black monk for the last time and dies with a smile of happiness on his face. Chekhov left the ending open, causing critics and readers to argue for decades. Who was this monk? Was he a benevolent genius who opened a man's eyes to his true potential, or a devilish tempter leading him into the abyss of madness and death? It is this duality that makes the image so powerful. Chekhov's story is not just a tale of illness. It is a profound reflection on the nature of genius and normality, on the price one must pay for being different. Kovrin is faced with a choice: a gray, boring but healthy existence, or a bright, exciting but insane life as a chosen one. And he chooses the latter. How does this relate to our investigation? Very directly. The story became incredibly popular in educated circles. The image of the Black Monk became a household name, a symbol of a mysterious force that can both elevate and destroy a person. When, years later, strange and inexplicable events began to occur at the court of Nicholas II, when a man appeared near the royal family whose influence seemed irrational and destructive, educated society involuntarily drew parallels. The literary ghost found its supposed embodiment in real life. It was easy to imagine that the emperor, like Kovrin, had fallen under the influence of a mystical mentor who instilled destructive ideas in him, passing them off as supreme wisdom. Thus, without knowing it, Chekhov created the perfect template for a future myth. He gave a name and form to the fear that was in the air. The Black Monk ceased to be just a character in a story. He became a convenient metaphor for explaining the political madness that had gripped the upper echelons of power. This literary doppelganger will haunt our investigation, for it was he who most likely gave the anonymous legend its sinister name. But to understand why this template fits so easily into the historical fabric, we need to understand the spiritual atmosphere of the royal family itself. To understand why the court of the last Russian emperor became fertile ground for all kinds of mystics and prophets, it is not enough to talk only about the personality of the sovereign himself. We need to look at the era as a whole. The late 19th and early 20th centuries, known as the Silver Age in Russian culture, were a time not only of great artistic breakthroughs, but also of deep spiritual crisis. Old foundations were crumbling, and the faith in progress and reason that had characterized the 19th century was cracking. It was replaced by an interest in everything irrational and otherworldly. The aristocratic salons of St. Petersburg and Moscow were swept up in a craze for seances. Summoning the spirits of the dead and receiving messages from them through a plate or knocking became almost a social pastime. At the same time, complex mystical teachings such as Helena Blavatsky's Theosophy and Rudolf Steiner's Anthroposophy gained popularity, promising the initiated access to the secret knowledge of the universe. It was a time when symbolist poets sought reflections of other worlds in earthly life, and artists tried to capture the invisible aura of objects on canvas. This pervasive mysticism was not the preserve of the bohemian elite. It seeped into all strata of society, including the highest aristocracy and even the royal family itself. Emperor Nicholas II, who ascended the throne in 1894, was a man whose worldview was shaped by this atmosphere. He was deeply religious, but his faith was very personal, even fatalistic. He believed in destiny, in fate, in the idea that his life path and that of Russia were predetermined by a higher power. He was born on the day of St. Job the Long-Suffering and, as they say, saw in this a special sign, a harbinger of future trials. This belief in predestination made him receptive to prophecies and omens. He sought not so much advice as confirmation that his actions were in accordance with some higher plan. Even more intense and passionate in this regard was his wife, Empress Alexandra Feodorovna. Born Princess Alice of Hesse-Darmstadt, she converted to Orthodox Christianity not formally, but with all the depth and fervor of her nature. She immersed herself in Russian religiosity, its rituals, and the veneration of icons and saints. However, her faith was tinged with constant anxiety. The main source of this anxiety was the illness of her only son, the heir to the throne, Alexei. He suffered from hemophilia, a terrible hereditary disease in which the blood does not clot. Any injury, even the slightest bruise or cut, could lead to excruciating pain, internal bleeding, and even death. Official medicine was powerless. Doctors could only recommend rest and caution, but could offer no treatment. Can you imagine the despair of a mother who sees her child suffering every day and realizes that she is completely powerless? It was this despair that opened the palace doors to those who promised something more than science could offer. Alexandra Feodorovna was ready to believe anyone who could at least temporarily ease her son's pain. She was looking for a miracle, and that made her the perfect target for all kinds of holy men, wanderers, holy fools, and healers who were all over the capital. So, the fascination with mysticism at court wasn't just a fad. It had deep personal roots. For Nicholas, it was a search for confirmation of his mission. For Alexandra, it was a desperate struggle for her son's life. Their court became a place where rational governance mixed with irrational belief in miracles and prophecies. And before the main and most controversial figure, Grigori Rasputin, appeared on the scene, the royal couple had to meet other bearers of secret knowledge, including a prophet whose predictions concerned the very fall of their dynasty. The legend of the Black Monk at the court of Nicholas II did not arise out of nowhere. It is woven into the more ancient fabric of mystical legends of the House of Romanov, and one of the most vivid threads in this fabric is the story of the monk prophet Avel. This figure, half legendary, half historical, lived at the turn of the 18th and 19th centuries, but his shadow, according to legend, covered the last Russian Tsar. Abel, born Vasily Vasiliev, a peasant, was born in 1757. Leaving his family, he entered a monastery, where, according to him, he received the gift of foresight. His prophecies were bold and dangerous. He predicted the exact date of the death of the reigning Empress Catherine II, for which he was thrown into the Schlisselburg fortress. When his prediction came true, the new emperor, Paul I, Catherine's son, became interested in the prisoner. He freed Abel and granted him a personal audience. And this is where the most mysterious part of the story begins. According to numerous sources, including the memoirs of courtiers recounted decades later, Abel told Paul Fern the fate of his descendants and the entire Russian Empire for the next 100 years, right up to his great-great-grandson, the future Emperor Nicholas II. These prophecies were so disturbing that Paul did not dare to make them public. He ordered them to be written down, placed in a special casket or envelope, sealed with his personal seal, and accompanied by an inscription, "To be opened by our descendant on the 100th day of my death." The casket was to be kept in the Gachina Palace, and none of the subsequent emperors, neither Alexander I, nor Nicholas I, nor Alexander II, nor Alexander III, dared to violate the will of their ancestor. The lot fell to Nicholas II. The fateful 100th anniversary of Paul III's assassination fell in March 1901. According to the memoirs of the Empress's lady-in-waiting, Anna Vyrobova, and other contemporaries, on March 11th or 12th, 1901, Nicholas Alexandrovich and Alexandra Feodorovna made a special trip from Tsarskoye Selo to the Gachina Palace. It is reported that they were preparing for this event as an interesting historical entertainment. However, the royal couple returned from Gachina, thoughtful and sad, and told no one what they had read in the mysterious message. What was in that box? There is no direct documentary evidence. We can only rely on retellings and reconstructions. According to them, Abel predicted to Nicholas II a crown of thorns, difficult trials for Russia, war, and revolution. Most importantly, he allegedly named the fateful year, 1918, the year of the death of the Tsar and his family. After that day, according to memoirists, the emperor often spoke of 1918 as a fateful year for himself and his dynasty. This story, regardless of its absolute veracity, is extremely important for our investigation. It shows that the idea of a monk prophet influencing the fate of a monarch was embedded in the very family tradition of the Romanovs. Nicholas II, upon opening the casket, did not simply read a text. He accepted the baton of a mystical connection with his ancestor, confirming for himself the reality of the prophecies and the inevitability of his fate. This event prepared him to accept other messages from above. If a monk who lived 100 years before him could so accurately foresee the future, why not listen to those men of God who live today? The legend of Abel set a precedent. It legitimized the presence of mystics near the throne. The figure of the monk seer became not frightening to Nicholas, but in a sense expected. He was ready to meet a man who would explain to him the will of providence. And soon, such people began to appear in his entourage. Long before the name of Grigori Rasputin resounded throughout Russia, another, much less known but no less characteristic of that era, man of God, set foot in the chambers of the Alexander Palace. His name was Mitya Kozelsky, also known as Mitya Gugnevi or Kolyaba. He was a holy fool, a phenomenon unique to Russian spiritual culture. Holy fools, or blessed ones, were people who voluntarily took on the appearance of madmen, renounced worldly goods, and spoke in riddles, often cloaking bitter truths or prophecies in bizarre forms. The people revered them as saints, capable of seeing what was hidden from the eyes of ordinary people. Mitya was just such a character. Illiterate, sickly, and with a speech impediment, he nevertheless possessed, according to rumors, the gift of clairvoyance and healing. He came from the vicinity of the famous Optina Desert, one of Russia's main spiritual centers, which added to his authority in the eyes of believers. At the beginning of the 20th century, his fame reached the capital, or more precisely, those who were constantly looking for new prayer leaders and comforters for the Empress. The meeting between the royal couple and Mitya Kozelski took place in January 1906. Nicholas II himself left a brief but very important note about this in his diary. Under the date of January 14th, he writes, "At 4 o'clock, a man of God named Dmitri from Kozelsk near the Optina Hermitage came to us. He brought an icon painted according to a vision he had recently had. We talked with him for about an hour and a half." This short excerpt reveals a lot. First, the very fact of the meeting. The Emperor of all Russia found an hour and a half in his schedule to talk to an illiterate holy fool. This shows the highest degree of trust and interest in such people. Second, the reason for the visit was an icon painted according to a vision. This means that the conversation was not on a rational level, but on a mystical one. The Tsar and Tsarina did not simply receive the petitioner. They came into contact with a world of miracles and revelations. We do not know exactly what they talked about during those hour and a half. But, according to some sources, Mitya made a strong impression on Alexandra Feodorovna. However, his career at court was short-lived. The character of the holy fool was unpredictable. He could be rude, and his behavior did not fit in with the strict palace etiquette. In addition, he had powerful enemies in the form of other spiritual authorities close to the Empress, who saw him as a rival. Soon, Mitya was removed from the court, and his place was taken by others. But the episode with Mitya Kozelski was a kind of rehearsal for the appearance of Rasputin. It demonstrates the mechanism by which such people found their way into the palace. First, rumors arose about a clairvoyant or healer. Then his patrons from among the aristocracy, most often the Empress's ladies-in-waiting, arranged an audience for him. If the man of God made the right impression on Alexandra Feodorovna, primarily with his sincere faith and prayerful attitude, he was granted access to the imperial family. This episode also helps us understand the psychology of the imperial couple. To a modern person, communication between the head of state and an ignorant holy fool may seem absurd. But for Nicholas and Alexandra, it was not communication with a madman, but a touch of the divine light. They believed that in the simplicity and even poverty of such people lay true holiness, unclouded by worldly pride and rationalism. They were not looking for political advice, but for spiritual purity and prayerful support. The figure of Mitya Kozelski does not fit into the sinister image of the Black Monk. He was rather pitiful and harmless, but his short stay in the palace showed how wide the doors were open to those who could offer the desperate Empress hope for a miracle. The system was in place. The stage was set. All that remained was to wait for an actor who could play this role with much greater panache and with far more tragic consequences. A name that became synonymous with the decline of the Russian Empire. A surname that is still pronounced with a shudder or a sneer. Grigori Yefimovich Rasputin. It is he who is most often referred to when people talk about the Black Monk or the evil genius at the court of the last Tsar. But was he a monk? No, he was a peasant from the remote Siberian village of Pokrovskoye in the Tobolsk province. But his path to the inner circle of the imperial family is a classic story of a man of God, only told on an epic scale. He was born, presumably, in 1869. In his youth, Gregory led a life typical of a Siberian peasant. He plowed the land, married, and had children. However, at some point, he underwent a spiritual transformation. He began to wander around holy places and monasteries in Russia, reaching Mount Athos in Greece and Jerusalem. He did not take monastic vows, remaining a layman, but gained a reputation as an elder, a spiritual mentor, a man with a special gift for prayer and insight. It is important to understand that elder, in the Russian tradition, is not an official church rank, but an unofficial title given by the people for special wisdom and righteous living. Rasputin, with his thick beard, piercing gaze, and ability to speak in parables, fit this image perfectly. In 1903, he arrived in St. Petersburg for the first time. In the capital, he quickly found influential patrons in church and aristocratic circles. He was recommended as a true man of God, a Siberian wanderer with the gift of consolation and healing. Among his first patrons were high-ranking church officials, such as Archimandrite Feofan, inspector of the St. Petersburg Theological Academy. Rasputin's first meeting with the royal family took place on November 1, 1905. Nicholas II, as always, made an entry in his diary. Met a man of God, Grigori from the Tobolsk province. This meeting was brief and introductory, but Rasputin managed to make the right impression. He did not speak like a court flatterer, but like a simple man, straightforward and blunt, yet with deep faith. He addressed the Tsar and Tsarina as father and mother, which shocked the courtiers. But to the monarchs themselves, it seemed a manifestation of holy simplicity. His real rise began a year later, in 1906, and was connected, as might be expected, with the illness of the heir to the throne. At one point, when Tsarevich Alexei became particularly ill after another fall, and the doctors threw up their hands in despair, someone from the Empress's entourage suggested calling the Siberian elder. And then, something happened that Alexandra Feodorovna considered a miracle. After Rasputin's prayers, the bleeding stopped, and the boy began to feel better. This incident was a turning point. From that moment on, Rasputin went from being just an interesting conversationalist to a necessary person. He became their friend, their last hope. Alexandra Feodorovna believed in him unconditionally. She saw him as a savior sent by God to protect her son. Any criticism of him was perceived by her as blasphemy and intrigue by enemies who envied their friend. For her, he was neither a black monk nor a political schemer. He was a saint whose prayers worked miracles. Thus, the mechanism tested on Mitya Kozelsky and others worked with Rasputin as well. But unlike his predecessors, Grigori Efimovich possessed not only a reputation as a righteous man, but also tremendous vitality, natural intelligence, hypnotic charm, and incredible ambition. He managed not only to enter the palace, but also to establish himself there for a long time, becoming one of the most influential and scandalous figures in pre-revolutionary Russia. To understand the Rasputin phenomenon, one must discard all mystical and political theories and focus on one thing that was most important to the Empress: the life of her son. The key to Rasputin's power over the minds of the royal couple lay not in political intrigue, but in the children's bedroom of the Alexander Palace, where a daily drama of struggle with death unfolded. Tsarevich Alexei Nikolaevich, born in 1904, inherited from his mother, or rather through her, from his great-grandmother, Queen Victoria, a rare and terrible genetic disease, hemophilia. This royal disease was passed down through the female line, but only men suffered from it. Essentially, it means that the blood lacks or has insufficient amounts of a protein responsible for clotting. For a healthy person, a cut is a minor inconvenience. For Alexei, it could be catastrophic, but even more frightening were the internal hemorrhages in his joints and muscles, which could start from the slightest bump or awkward movement. This caused acute, excruciating pain. His joints swelled to incredible sizes, and the boy screamed for hours, sometimes for days on end. The medicine of the early 20th century was powerless. The best doctors in the empire, professors with European names, could only prescribe complete rest, apply ice, and administer morphine to relieve the pain. But they could not stop the bleeding. Each such attack was hell for Alexandra Feodorovna. A deeply religious woman, she saw her son's suffering as punishment for sins and prayed for a miracle. And the miracle, in her eyes, came in the form of a Siberian peasant. There are many documented accounts, including letters and diaries of the Empress herself and her lady-in-waiting Anna Vyrabova, about how Rasputin helped the heir. The most famous case occurred in the fall of 1912 when the royal family was vacationing in Spa, Poland. Alexei jumped into a boat unsuccessfully and severely bruised his hip. Severe internal bleeding began. The boy's condition was so critical that doctors prepared for the worst, and a bulletin was even published announcing that he was in mortal danger. Desperate, Alexandra Feodorovna sent a telegram to Rasputin, who was in Siberia. The reply came, "God has heard your tears and prayers. Do not grieve. The little one will not die. Do not let the doctors torment him too much." On the same day, after receiving the telegram, the crisis passed and the boy began to recover. How can this be explained? Skeptics and historians offer several rational versions. First, Rasputin, possessing an undeniable gift of suggestion and hypnotic influence, could calm both the boy himself and, more importantly, his mother. His confident, calm voice and his words, "It's okay, everything will be fine," relieved panic and stress. And stress, as we know, raises blood pressure and increases bleeding. Calming down, Alexandra Feodorovna stopped fussing over her son, creating an atmosphere of peace in the room, which had a beneficial effect on the patient. Secondly, his advice, "Don't let the doctors torture him too much," was very sensible. Doctors at that time often prescribed aspirin as a painkiller, not knowing that it thins the blood and is strictly contraindicated in hemophilia. By removing the doctors and their medicines, Rasputin, without knowing it, eliminated the factor that was aggravating the disease. Perhaps other, not yet fully understood psychosomatic mechanisms were also at work, but for Alexandra Feodorovna, there was no other explanation except divine intervention. Rasputin was a man who could do what the best minds of science could not. He saved her son, and after that, any criticism of him, any accusations of drunkenness, debauchery, or political intrigue were shattered against the unbreakable wall of her motherly gratitude. "A saint when he's not here, and the devil when he is," she said of him. She was ready to forgive him all his earthly sins as long as his prayers saved Alexei. This bond, mixed with blood and tears, became the foundation on which his incredible power grew. If Grigori Rasputin's influence had been limited to the heir's bedroom, he might have remained in history as nothing more than a court healer and psychic. But his closeness to the imperial family, especially to the Empress, inevitably began to translate into political capital. This is where the most controversial and dark chapter of his biography begins, which provided the main fodder for the legend of the Black Monk who secretly ruled the state. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 was the catalyst. Emperor Nicholas II, loyal to his duty, assumed supreme command in 1915 and left for the general headquarters in Mogilev. The administration of the empire's internal affairs effectively fell into the hands of Alexandra Feodorovna. The only person whose opinion she trusted unconditionally was our friend, Grigori Rasputin. The Empress corresponded regularly with her husband, and her letters are full of advice, which, as she herself admitted, came from Rasputin. "Listen to our friend. He prays for you and asks me to tell you this and that." Such phrases appear constantly. Rasputin, an illiterate Siberian peasant, began to give advice on the most complex issues of state life: the appointment of ministers, military operations, food supplies. He did not sit in offices or write decrees. His influence was different, more subtle. A stream of supplicants flocked to his apartment on Gorokovaya Street in St. Petersburg. Careerists seeking ministerial portfolios, financiers seeking lucrative contracts, and adventurers of all stripes. They knew that if they secured the support of the old man, he could use the Empress to convey any idea to the Tsar himself. A period began that contemporaries sarcastically called ministerial musical chairs. Ministers replaced one another with kaleidoscopic speed. Presidents of the Council of Ministers, Ministers of the Interior, Ministers of War. Many of them received their posts after being approved by Rasputin and lost them just as quickly if they displeased the old man or his entourage. Of course, it would be simplistic to say that Rasputin was an all-powerful dictator. Often, he merely supported a candidate who already had a chance of being appointed. Sometimes various court cliques fighting for power simply used his name as a cover. But the very fact that the opinion of an illiterate peasant could decide the fate of a minister of a huge empire was shocking and demoralizing for society. It undermined the very foundation of monarchical power, its sacredness and authority. At the same time, some of Rasputin's advice, when viewed objectively, was quite sound. For example, he was a staunch opponent of Russia's entry into the war, sensing that it would bring untold misfortune to the country. He often spoke about the needs of ordinary peasants, about the injustice and corruption of officials, things that could not be seen from the palace windows. But these rare moments of sound thinking were drowned out by a flood of dubious appointments and intrigues. Rasputin became the center of a web of corruption, even if he himself was not always aware of his role. He received petitioners, took gifts from them, money that he immediately distributed to others in need, and put in a good word for them with the mother, Tsarina. For him, this was a natural, patriarchal system of relationships. For the imperial state apparatus, it was a deadly disease. Rasputin's power was not absolute, but rather atmospheric. He created a poisonous atmosphere of rumors, gossip, denunciations, and personal sympathies around the throne, in which professional and independent statesmen could not survive. They resigned and were replaced by weak-willed or incompetent appointees whose only merit was their loyalty to the old man. It was this situation that gave many the feeling that the country was ruled not by Nicholas II, but by an invisible, sinister black monk. While within the palace walls, Rasputin was our friend and holy elder, outside, in the eyes of virtually all of Russia, his image took on increasingly demonic features. The figure of the Siberian peasant became the focal point for all hatred of the government and all discontent with the war and the chaos. He became the perfect scapegoat on whom all the country's troubles could be blamed. The press, although subject to military censorship, waged a veritable war against him. Newspapers could not write about him directly, but used hints and allegorical language. He was called the Old Man, a well-known personality, and a dark force. Malicious caricatures circulated, depicting Rasputin as a giant spider entangling Russia in its web, or as a puppeteer pulling the strings of the Tsar and Tsarina. One of the main themes of this campaign was rumors of his incredible debauchery. There were stories about drunken orgies he held in St. Petersburg restaurants and his numerous mistresses from high society. He was rumored to have had affairs not only with the Empress's ladies-in-waiting, but also with the Empress herself, and even her daughters, the Grand Duchesses. These rumors were most likely gross exaggerations. Rasputin was indeed a man with strong carnal appetites. He loved to drink and was no stranger to female company. He was surrounded by a crowd of enthusiastic admirers who saw him as something between a saint and a superhuman. But the stories about his seduction of the Empress and her daughters were malicious slander designed to strike at the most sacred thing, the honor of the royal family, and thereby delegitimize the monarchy in the eyes of the people. The image of the saint and the image of the debauched man paradoxically merged into one. The nickname Holy Devil was born. For many, he was just that, a tempter in the clothes of a righteous man who preached about God while wallowing in sin. His teaching that one can only repent after sinning, which he may have preached in a small circle, was interpreted as a direct justification of debauchery. Hatred of Rasputin united seemingly incompatible forces. He was opposed by liberal politicians from the State Duma, who saw him as a symbol of autocratic despotism. He was opposed by the aristocracy, including members of the imperial family themselves, the Grand Dukes, who believed that the peasant was bringing shame on the dynasty. He was opposed by many church hierarchs who had initially supported him but were then horrified by the extent of his influence and scandalous reputation. And, of course, he was opposed by the army, whose officers believed that the German Tsarina and her favorite Rasputin were traitors leading Russia to defeat in the war. Rasputin became a convenient and understandable embodiment of evil. In the complex political and economic situation in which the country found itself, it was much easier to believe that one evil and depraved man was to blame for everything than to analyze the root causes of the crisis. Remove Rasputin and everything will be fine. This idea became increasingly obsessive in the minds of many people, from Duma deputies to Grand Dukes. He was no longer just a man, he was a symbol of the disease that had struck the body politic. And like any dangerous symptom, they wanted to remove him at any cost. The atmosphere around Rasputin was thickening. He himself sensed the approaching disaster, which we will discuss later. The campaign in the press and society prepared the ground for the tragic denouement. It created an image not just of a man, but of a monster whose murder could be considered not a sin, but a patriotic deed. The image of the Black Monk became completely synonymous with the personality of Grigori Rasputin. Despite the image of a depraved and ignorant man created by public rumor, Grigori Rasputin undoubtedly possessed natural intuition and a kind of gift of foresight. Many of his statements, which his contemporaries considered the ravings of a madman, began to look like true prophecies after the tragic events of 1917 to 1918. These prophecies concerned three key themes: war, his own death, and the fate of the Romanov dynasty. The most famous and well-documented was his desperate resistance to Russia's entry into World War I. In the summer of 1914, at the height of the July crisis, Rasputin was at his home in the village of Pokrovskoye, recovering from an assassination attempt by Khayonia Guseva. Upon learning of the mobilization, he sent several desperate, almost incoherent, but very emotional telegrams to the Tsar and his entourage. In them, he begged his father not to start the war. He predicted that the war would bring the end of Russia, that the country would be flooded with seas of tears and oceans of blood. If Russia gets involved in the war, it will be the end of Russia and the dynasty, was the essence of his messages. Nicholas II received these telegrams but did not attach any importance to them. He was under pressure from his generals and allied commitments. A wave of patriotism swept through the capital, and the voice of a Siberian peasant seemed out of place and cowardly. Later, during the war, Rasputin repeatedly advised making a separate peace with Germany, which gave rise to rumors of his treason and collaboration with the Germans. However, from his point of view, this was not treason, but an attempt to save the country from the catastrophe he foresaw. The second group of his prophecies concerned his own fate. As hatred for him grew in society, he spoke more and more often of his imminent death. He knew that an assassination attempt was being planned against him and, most importantly, he directly linked his death to the fate of the royal family. His famous letter testament, believed to have been written in December 1916, shortly before his murder, has been preserved. The authenticity of this document is disputed by some historians, but its text perfectly reflects what Rasputin said in the last months of his life. In this letter, he addresses the Tsar. "I feel that I will leave this life before January 1st. If I am killed by hired assassins, Russian peasants, my brothers, then you, Russian Tsar, have no one to fear. Remain on your throne and reign. But if I am killed by the boyars, the nobility, then know that none of your children will live to see 2 years. They will be killed by the Russian people. Brothers will rise up against brothers. And for 25 years, there will be no nobility in the state." And the most terrible prediction: if the murder is committed by your relatives, then no one in your family, that is, neither children nor relatives, will live longer than 2 years. They will be killed by the Russian people. I will be killed. I am no longer alive. Pray, pray, be strong. Think of your blessed family. This prediction is striking in its accuracy. He was killed by the boyars, the aristocrats, and among them was a relative of the Tsar, his niece's husband, Prince Felix Yusupov. And indeed, less than 2 years later, the entire royal family was shot. The dynasty that had ruled Russia for 300 years collapsed. These prophecies, whether they were the result of mystical insight or the simple logical calculations of an intelligent and perceptive man who saw where the country was headed, created an aura of fatality around Rasputin. He appears not just as a schemer or a healer, but as a bearer of doom, a man whose life and death were inextricably linked to the fate of an entire empire. For Alexandra Feodorovna, his murder was not just the loss of a friend, but a sign that his most terrible prediction was coming true, and that now nothing could protect her family. The legend of the Black Monk came to its tragic end. The monk did not simply predict doom, he made it inevitable by linking it to his own death. By the end of 1916, hatred for Rasputin in the highest circles of Russian society had reached boiling point. The idea that the old man must be physically eliminated ceased to be a seditious thought and became a concrete plan. 3 completely different figures, united by a common goal, became the center of the conspiracy. The first was Prince Felix Yusupov, heir to one of Russia's richest families and husband of the emperor's niece, Irina Alexandrovna. A young, eccentric aristocrat, he saw Rasputin's murder as a patriotic feat, a way to save the monarchy and the reputation of the royal family. The second was Vladimir Purishkevich, a well-known right-wing politician and member of the State Duma. A staunch monarchist, he believed that Rasputin was discrediting the very idea of autocracy and leading the country to revolution. The third and most high-ranking conspirator was Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, Nicholas II's cousin. His participation lent weight and legitimacy to the conspiracy in the eyes of the aristocracy. The plan devised by Yusupov was simple and theatrical. He decided to lure Rasputin to his luxurious palace on the Moika River under the pretext of a meeting with his famous beautiful wife Irina, whom the old man had long been interested in. On the night of December 16, 17, according to the old calendar, 1916, Yusupov picked up Rasputin in his car and brought him to his palace. The further events are known mainly from the words of Yusupov and Purishkevich themselves, and their stories are full of mystical and implausible details, probably intended to emphasize the diabolical vitality of their victim. Rasputin was taken to a specially prepared basement where he was offered cakes and wine laced with cyanide. According to Yusupov, Rasputin ate several cakes and drank several glasses of Madeira, but for some reason, the poison had no effect on him. He remained cheerful and asked to be shown his beautiful wife. In a panic, Yusupov went upstairs to his accomplices, took Dmitri Pavlovich's revolver, went back downstairs, and shot Rasputin in the heart. He fell. The conspirators decided that it was all over. However, when Yusupov approached the body a short time later, Rasputin, according to his account, suddenly opened his eyes, jumped to his feet, and with a devilish roar, rushed at his killer. He ran out into the courtyard, shouting, "Felix! Felix! I'll tell the queen everything!" Purishkevich, who was in the courtyard, opened fire. He fired 4 shots, hitting his target twice, in the back and in the back of the head. Only then did Rasputin finally fall into the snow. To hide the traces of the crime, the conspirators wrapped the body in heavy cloth, took it by car to Petrovsky Bridge, and threw it into an icy hole in the Malaya Nevka River. They were sure that the water would hide their secret forever. But after a few days, the body floated to the surface and was discovered by the police. The investigation immediately led to the conspirators. Their involvement was obvious. However, despite his grief and anger, Nicholas II did not decide on harsh punishment for the murderers, among whom was his cousin. Dmitri Pavlovich was sent to the Persian front, which, ironically, saved his life after the revolution, and Yusupov was exiled to his estate. The leniency of the punishment showed the whole society how weak the imperial power had become. The murder of Rasputin, conceived as an act to save the monarchy, actually became one of the last nails in its coffin. It solved no problems, but it shocked and terrified the Empress, isolating her completely from the rest of the world, and demonstrating that even members of the imperial family were willing to kill to achieve political goals. The country was on the brink of chaos. The murder of Grigori Rasputin did not bring its conspirators the results they had hoped for. They hoped that by eliminating the dark force, they would open the emperor's eyes, return sensible ministers to the government, and restore public confidence in the monarchy. The opposite happened. For Empress Alexandra Feodorovna, this murder was not just a personal tragedy, but confirmation of the most terrible prophecy of our friend, and a sign of the final betrayal by the aristocracy, and even her own relatives. She withdrew even more into herself and her grief, seeing enemies everywhere. Her trust was now limited to a very small circle of people who were loyal to Rasputin's memory. Anyone who approved of the murder automatically became her personal enemy. Nicholas II, torn between anger at the murderers and pressure from his family, showed weakness. The lenient punishment for the conspirators, essentially exile instead of hard labor, was received with mixed feelings by society. For some, it was proof that the Tsar was afraid of his own aristocracy. For others, it meant that he himself secretly approved of the elimination of his tiresome favorite. Neither version added to his authority. The political crisis only worsened. The ministerial merry-go-round continued. People recommended by Rasputin were appointed to key posts, which the Empress considered her duty to his memory. For example, Alexander Protopopov, a man whose incompetence was obvious to everyone except the Empress, was appointed Minister of the Interior. This caused a new wave of outrage in the State Duma and among the public. Rasputin's killers instantly became national heroes. Their portraits were sold on the streets, and they received enthusiastic letters. This fact clearly demonstrated the gulf that had opened up between the authorities and the people. The crime committed by the aristocrats was perceived as a heroic deed in the name of Russia. It was a dangerous symptom of the collapse of the sense of justice in the country. But most importantly, The murder did not stop the looming revolution. On the contrary, it may have accelerated it. By eliminating Rasputin, the conspirators removed a convenient lightning rod. Previously, he could be blamed for all the troubles. Now that he was gone, and the situation in the country continued to deteriorate, prices were rising, there was a shortage of bread, and the hated war continued. The anger of the people turned directly against the Tsar and Tsarina. The last, albeit mythical, buffer between the monarch and popular discontent had disappeared. A little over 2 months passed after Rasputin's murder. At the end of February 1917, unrest broke out in Petrograd due to bread shortages, which quickly escalated into a general strike and an armed uprising. The troops sent to suppress the rebellion began to defect to the rebels. The State Duma formed a provisional government. The monarchy collapsed within a few days. Did Rasputin's prophecy come true? Amazingly, yes. He was killed by aristocrats and a member of the royal family. Less than 3 months later, the dynasty that had ruled for 300 years lost its throne. Less than 2 years after his death, in July 1918, the entire family of Nicholas II, himself, his wife, son, and 4 daughters, was brutally murdered by the Russian people in the form of the Ural Bolsheviks. The connection between these events is, of course, not mystical, but historical. Rasputin's murder was not the cause of the revolution, but it became its vivid symptom and prologue. It showed the agony of the old regime, its inability to cope with internal contradictions, and its loss of all authority. The Black Monk was dead, but the shadows that had gathered around the throne did not disappear. They merely turned into a hurricane that swept away both the throne and those who sat on it. The collapse of the monarchy in February 1917 happened with stunning speed. Emperor Nicholas II, who was at headquarters in Mogilev, found himself cut off from the capital and his family. Receiving panicked telegrams about the chaos in Petrograd, he made a decision under pressure from his generals and representatives of the Duma that he believed would save Russia from civil war. On March 2, 1917, in his saloon car at Pskov station, he signed a manifesto renouncing the throne for himself and his son, Alexei, in favor of his younger brother, Grand Duke Mikhail Alexandrovich. In his diary that day, he wrote the now famous phrase, "All around is treason, cowardice, and deceit." Mikhail, however, did not dare to reign, declaring that he would accept supreme power only by the will of the Constituent Assembly. 300 years of Romanov rule came to an end. For Nicholas, now just Colonel Romanov, his cavalry began, his personal Golgotha. On March 8th, he was effectively arrested by the provisional government and placed under house arrest with his family in the Alexander Palace in Tsarskoye Selo. The first months of confinement passed in relative quiet. The family lived their normal life as much as possible. They walked in the park, read, and spent time with their children. However, hatred for the former monarchs, especially for the German Tsarina, grew in revolutionary Petrograd. Fearing mob justice, the provisional government decided in August 1917 to send the family far away from the capital to the Siberian city of Tobolsk. It was a journey into the unknown. The Romanov family settled in the house of the former governor. Their regime became stricter, and their isolation from the world almost complete. They endured all the hardships with courage, finding solace in their faith and in each other. Nicholas read a lot, chopped wood, and taught the children. They lived in the hope that they would be left alone. But in October 1917, a new revolution took place in Russia. The Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, came to power. Their attitude toward the former Tsar was much harsher. For them, he was not just citizen Romanov, but Nicholas the Bloody, a symbol of the hated old world and a potential banner for all counter-revolutionary forces. In the spring of 1918, by decision of Moscow, the family was moved even further away, to the red capital of the Urals, Yekaterinburg. Here they were placed in the requisitioned house of engineer Ipatiev, which the Bolsheviks called the House of Special Purpose. It was a real prison. A high double fence hid the house from the outside world. The windows were painted over with lime, and the guards were rude and hostile. The family was completely cut off from any contact. Their life turned into a series of humiliations. In the summer of 1918, White Army troops were approaching Yekaterinburg. The fate of the royal family was sealed. The Bolshevik leadership in Moscow and the Urals feared that the Romanovs would be freed and become a living symbol of resistance. On the night of July 16 to 17, 1918, almost exactly 1 year and 7 months after Rasputin's murder, the royal family and their few remaining servants were awakened and ordered to go down to the basement of the house. They were told that the city was in turmoil and that it was for their own safety. When they had all gathered in the small room, the commandant, Yakov Yurovsky, read out their death sentence. Before they had time to comprehend what was happening, the firing squad opened fire. Thus ended the tragic life of the last Russian emperor, his wife, their 5 children, and their loyal servants. Their journey from the royal palaces to the bloody basement of the Ipatiev house was over. The prophecies, legends, and rumors that surrounded their lives were replaced by the terrible and undeniable reality of their death. The death of the royal family did not put an end to the story of the dark forces at court. On the contrary, it became the starting point for the creation of a grandiose myth in which Grigori Rasputin took center stage, finally becoming a pop culture black monk. After the revolution and civil war, both Soviet propaganda and white émigré literature, albeit from different perspectives, set about constructing an image of Rasputin as the main cause of all evils. For the Bolsheviks, he was the perfect symbol of the decay and moral decline of the autocracy. In Soviet history, textbooks, films, and books, he was portrayed as a cunning and depraved man who, taking advantage of the Tsar's ignorance and the Tsarina's hysteria, effectively ruled the country and brought it to war and revolution. This image was convenient because it allowed the entire monarchical system to be portrayed as rotten to the core and justified its violent overthrow. In émigré circles, among those who had lost the old Russia, there was also a need for someone to blame for the catastrophe. Many monarchists could not and would not acknowledge the mistakes of Nicholas II himself. It was much easier to blame everything on the demonic influence of one man. In their works, Rasputin was transformed not just into a debauched man, but into a real sorcerer, a German spy, an agent of the world behind the scenes who deliberately destroyed the empire. Thus, from a complex and controversial historical figure, he was transformed into a flat, cardboard villain. Western cinema made a huge contribution to the mythologization of Rasputin. Already in the 1920s and 1930s, films were released in which Rasputin was portrayed as a mad monk, although he was not a monk, with hypnotic powers and an insatiable thirst for power and carnal pleasures. The image created in Hollywood and European films became classic. A tall man with burning eyes, a thick black beard, dressed in black, who subjugates women with a single glance and forces the Tsar to make insane decisions. It was cinema that finally cemented his visual image as the Black Monk. This figure proved to be very convenient for mass culture. It had everything you need for a good thriller: mysticism, sex, politics, murder. Rasputin's story became an international brand. Countless books were written about him, Musicals and even operas were staged. In the 1970s, the famous disco group Boney M released the global hit Rasputin, which described him as the lover of the Russian Tsarina and the greatest love machine. This song probably did more to perpetuate the myth than dozens of historical works. As a result of this long-standing cultural treatment, the historical Grigori Yefimovich Rasputin has almost disappeared, dissolving into his mythical double. His prophecies against war and his attempts to speak on behalf of the common people have been forgotten. Only scandals, rumors, and his dramatic death have come to the fore. He became a universal symbol of sinister influence, an archetype of the Grey Cardinal, the sorcerer at the throne. Thus, answering the question of why Rasputin is often called the Black Monk, we come to the conclusion that this is the result of a complex cultural process. First, the shadow of Chekhov's literary character was projected onto him. Second, his real scandalous reputation and enormous influence fueled the most incredible rumors. And third, after his death, both propaganda and mass culture spent 100 years molding him into the image of an infernal villain who perfectly fit the archetype of the evil monk advisor. The historical truth was buried under a thick layer of this cultural myth, so our investigation has come to an end. We started with a simple question: who was the Black Monk at the court of Nicholas II? And now we can give a definitive answer. No such person ever existed. The Black Monk is a ghost, a phantom born at the intersection of literature, fear, and political propaganda. It is a historical myth that has proven more powerful and enduring than many real facts. We have discovered that this myth had several sources. The first, and perhaps the one that gave it its name, is Anton Chekhov's brilliant short story, written before Nicholas II came to power. It introduced into Russian culture the image of a mysterious monk symbolizing genius on the verge of madness, and this image proved to be a very convenient template for explaining subsequent events. The second source was the atmosphere of the era itself, imbued with mysticism and a search for miracles. The court of the last emperor, and especially Nicholas himself and his wife Alexandra, were extremely receptive to prophecies and God's people. The legend of the monk Avel, who predicted the fate of the dynasty, and the appearance at court of the holy fool Mitya Kozelsky prepared the ground for the arrival of the main figure. And that figure, of course, was Grigori Efimovich Rasputin. It was his personality that became the core around which the myth of the Black Monk crystallized. He was not a monk, but his image as an old man, his influence on the Empress, mixed up in her desperate struggle for the life of her sick son, his scandalous reputation, and his real, albeit exaggerated, interference in politics. All this made him the ideal candidate for the role of the sinister Grey Cardinal. He was not the cause, but a symptom of a deep disease that had afflicted the Russian Empire. A symptom of a crisis of power, a loss of trust between the monarch and the people, a rift between the elite and society. His demonization after his death, both in the Soviet Union and among émigrés, as well as his portrayal in popular culture, ultimately transformed him from a real, complex, and contradictory person into a convenient and understandable brand of mad monk. Thus, the story of the Black Monk is not the story of one evil man who destroyed a great empire. It is a story about how, at turning points in history, society tends to seek simple answers to complex questions. How easy it is to believe in a conspiracy theory, in the evil will of a single puppet master, instead of acknowledging the existence of deep systemic problems. Rasputin was not a puppet master. He was more like a crooked mirror that reflected all the vices, fears, and superstitions of his time. The tragedy of the last reign does not lie in the fact that it was ruined by some black monk. It was that the emperor and his entourage, at a decisive moment for the country, proved incapable of distinguishing real threats from illusory ones, and sober political calculation from mystical revelations. They sought salvation in the prayers of dubious elders, while a real storm was already raging outside the windows of their palace. In this sense, the Black Monk was indeed present at the court of Nicholas II, but he was not in Rasputin's chambers. He lived in people's minds, in their hearts, in the atmosphere of universal fear and foreboding of disaster, which ultimately engulfed old Russia. The fog clears, and behind the figure of the sinister monk, we see not a demon, but only a tragic story about the last Tsar, his family, and his country, which stood on the brink of the abyss.